Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's arrogance collided headfirst with centuries of tradition? When modern authority tried to override ancient protocol, only to discover that some boundaries simply cannot be crossed? This is the story of such a moment, a clash that lasted mere minutes, but revealed the profound difference between power and respect, between commanding and earning authority. It happened at one of the world's most prestigious royal residences, where protocol isn't just tradition, it's sacred duty. An American military officer, accustomed to being obeyed without question, encountered a force he never expected. A royal guard whose loyalty transcended nations, ranks, and diplomatic courtesy. What followed wasn't just an embarrassing miscalculation. It was a masterclass in dignity, duty, and the quiet power of unwavering principle. This is that story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle's courtyard as Colonel James Mitchell straightened his dress uniform for the third time in 5 minutes. The American officer had spent 22 years in the military, commanding respect from soldiers across 3 continents. But today felt different. Today, he wasn't just representing the United States Army. He was part of a joint military ceremony that would be witnessed by royalty, diplomats, and media from around the world. Mitchell had arrived in England 3 days earlier as part of a cultural exchange program designed to strengthen military ties between the United States and the United Kingdom. The ceremony was meant to be a symbolic gesture of cooperation, with officers from both nations participating in a formal parade before the royal family. For Mitchell, it represented the pinnacle of his career, a chance to demonstrate American military precision on one of the world's most prestigious stages. The colonel was a man accustomed to control. Throughout his career, he had earned a reputation for demanding excellence and accepting nothing less than perfect execution from his subordinates. His soldiers respected him, though some might have used the word feared instead. Mitchell believed that respect came through strength, that authority was something you took rather than earned, and that rank alone should guarantee obedience regardless of circumstances or cultural differences. As he walked through the ancient corridors of Windsor Castle, Mitchell couldn't help but feel a surge of pride mixed with subtle irritation. The pomp and ceremony impressed him, certainly, but he found the elaborate protocols somewhat excessive. In his world, efficiency trumped ceremony every time. He had studied the day's schedule meticulously, noting every detail, every timing requirement, every position he needed to maintain. What he hadn't fully grasped was that he was no longer operating in his familiar military environment. He was a guest in a system governed by traditions that predated his country's existence. The royal guards he encountered throughout the castle struck him as unnecessarily rigid. They stood at attention with a stillness that seemed almost inhuman, their famous red uniforms and towering bearskin hats making them appear more like decorative statues than active military personnel. Mitchell had heard stories about their training, their dedication, their refusal to break character under any circumstances, but he dismissed much of it as theatrical tradition designed to impress tourists. To Mitchell, they were simply soldiers wearing costumes, and soldiers, regardless of nationality, should recognize superior rank and authority when they encountered it. He had commanded Marines, Army Rangers, and Special Forces operatives. Surely these ceremonial guards, impressive as their reputation might be, would respond to proper military authority when the situation demanded it. The morning briefing had gone smoothly enough. British officers had explained the day's procedures with typical understated efficiency, outlining the route, the timing, the positions each participant would maintain. Mitchell had asked few questions. The plan seemed straightforward, and he was confident in his ability to execute his role flawlessly. What could go wrong? He was a decorated officer representing his country in a friendly, ceremonial environment. But as the morning progressed, small details began to irritate him. The pace felt unnecessarily slow. The attention to seemingly minor protocol points struck him as obsessive. When a British major spent 10 minutes explaining the proper angle for sword salutes, Mitchell found himself checking his watch and wondering why such simple matters required such elaborate explanation. In his experience, good soldiers adapted quickly to new requirements. All this ceremony seemed designed to complicate rather than clarify. The first sign of trouble came during the initial formation. Mitchell had positioned himself according to the briefing materials, but when the parade began to move, he noticed that his location put him slightly behind where he felt he should be. As a colonel, he outranked several of the British officers who were positioned ahead of him in the formation. The arrangement felt wrong, hierarchically speaking, and Mitchell's instinct was to correct it. He began to move forward, intending to assume what he considered his proper position based on rank rather than the predetermined ceremonial arrangement. It was a small adjustment, or so he thought, barely noticeable to observers, and certainly justified by military protocol as he understood it. But the moment he stepped out of his assigned position, he felt the subtle shift in attention around him. The British officers maintained their composure, but Mitchell could sense their disapproval. One of them, a major who had been friendly during the briefing, caught his eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of the head. Mitchell hesitated, uncertain whether to continue with his adjustment or return to his original position. In that moment of hesitation, he made a decision that would define the rest of his day. He decided to assert his authority. Instead of returning to his assigned position, Mitchell continued forward, positioning himself according to what he believed was proper military hierarchy. He told himself that good leadership sometimes required making decisions that others might find uncomfortable. If the British officers had made an error in their formation planning, it was his duty to correct it. He was, after all, a colonel in the United States Army, and rank should translate across international boundaries. The ceremony continued, but Mitchell could feel the tension building around him. The British officers maintained their professional demeanor, but there was a coolness in their interactions that hadn't been there before. Mitchell told himself he had done the right thing. Leadership required making tough decisions, and sometimes those decisions created temporary discomfort. The important thing was maintaining proper military standards, regardless of local customs or political sensitivities. As they moved through the castle grounds, Mitchell began to notice the royal guards more closely. They lined the route at precise intervals, each one a perfect statue of military bearing. Their stillness was remarkable, their attention unwavering despite the crowds, the cameras, the general commotion of the ceremony. Mitchell found himself studying them with professional interest, noting their discipline even as he mentally cataloged what he saw as the limitations of their purely ceremonial role. It was then that he noticed something that would prove to be crucial later in the day. The guards weren't just standing at attention. They were actively monitoring everything around them. Their eyes, barely visible beneath their imposing bearskin hats, tracked movement with the precision of trained security personnel. These weren't just ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. They were active-duty military personnel executing a security mission while maintaining the appearance of traditional ceremony. The realization should have given Mitchell pause, should have reminded him that he was operating in an environment governed by rules and traditions he didn't fully understand. Instead, it reinforced his belief that these were simply soldiers doing their jobs, and soldiers, regardless of their uniforms or their traditions, should recognize proper authority when they encountered it. The morning ceremony concluded without major incident, though Mitchell could sense that his earlier position adjustment had created ripples of tension that hadn't fully dissipated. During the brief break before the afternoon's more formal events, he found himself approached by the British major who had tried to signal him earlier. "Colonel Mitchell," the major said quietly, his tone carefully neutral, "I wonder if we might have a brief word about this afternoon's procedures." Mitchell nodded, following the major to a quiet corner of the castle courtyard. The conversation that followed was polite, professional, and utterly clear in its implications. The major explained, with typical British diplomacy, that the afternoon ceremony would be even more formal than the morning events, with stricter protocol requirements and less flexibility for individual interpretation. "I understand your concern about hierarchical positioning," the major said carefully, "but I must emphasize that today's ceremony follows specific traditional protocols that have been established over centuries. The positioning is based on ceremonial role rather than military rank, and any deviation from the established plan could create complications. Mitchell listened politely, but internally he bristled at what he perceived as condescension. The major was trying to tell him how to behave, how to represent his country, how to fulfill his military duties. Mitchell had commanded soldiers in combat zones, had made life-death decisions under pressure, had earned his rank through decades of dedicated service. He didn't need a British major, regardless of how diplomatically the message was delivered, telling him how to conduct himself at a ceremonial parade. "I appreciate your guidance, Major," Mitchell replied, his tone equally professional but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I'm confident that I can fulfill my responsibilities appropriately. After 22 years of military service, I understand the importance of following orders and maintaining proper standards." The major nodded, but Mitchell could see the concern in his eyes. They both understood that nothing had actually been resolved by their conversation. The afternoon would bring another test, another opportunity for Mitchell to either conform to established protocol or assert what he saw as proper military hierarchy. As lunch concluded and the afternoon ceremony approached, Mitchell felt his confidence returning. He had represented his country in challenging situations before. He had maintained American military standards in foreign environments, had worked successfully with international partners, had earned respect from allies and subordinates alike. Today would be no different. If anything, the morning's events had clarified the situation for him. He needed to be more decisive, more willing to assert appropriate American leadership when the situation called for it. The afternoon ceremony would take place in the castle's main courtyard, with members of the royal family in attendance, along with diplomatic representatives from several nations. The stakes were higher, the visibility greater, the need for flawless execution absolute. Mitchell understood all of this intellectually, but his interpretation of flawless execution was about to collide with centuries of British military tradition in a way that would create ripples far beyond the ancient walls of Windsor Castle. As he prepared for the afternoon ceremony, Mitchell made a mental commitment that would prove to be his undoing. He decided that if the situation arose again, if he found himself positioned inappropriately based on his rank and experience, he would take decisive action to correct it. He would not allow diplomatic niceties or cultural traditions to prevent him from properly representing American military excellence. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the castle windows as Mitchell completed his final preparations. In a few hours, he would find himself face to face with a royal guard whose sense of duty would prove to be even stronger than his own determination to assert authority. The collision between American confidence and British tradition was about to begin, and neither man involved had any idea how completely it would transform their understanding of respect, authority, and the true meaning of military bearing. The afternoon ceremony began with the kind of precision that only centuries of practice can produce. Every movement had been choreographed, every position calculated, every timing rehearsed until it became second nature. The royal family took their places on the reviewing platform, their presence lending gravity to what was already a solemn occasion. Diplomatic representatives from 12 nations stood in carefully arranged groups, each delegation positioned according to protocols that balanced political sensitivity with ceremonial tradition. Mitchell found himself assigned to the third row of the American delegation, a position that placed him behind a Navy captain and an Air Force colonel, both of whom technically held equivalent rank but had been positioned according to the ceremony's specific requirements. The arrangement was logical from a ceremonial perspective. It balanced the visual composition of the international delegations while ensuring that no single nation appeared to dominate the proceedings. But logic, Mitchell was discovering, didn't always align with pride. Standing behind officers he considered his equals, Mitchell felt the familiar irritation beginning to build. Around him, representatives from other nations seemed content with their assigned positions, focused on executing their roles flawlessly rather than concerning themselves with hierarchical details. The German officers stood with Prussian precision. The French delegation maintained their famous military bearing, and the Canadian representatives demonstrated the quiet competence their military was known for. Only Mitchell seemed troubled by the arrangement. As the ceremony progressed through its initial phases, Mitchell's attention began to wander from the proceedings to the royal guards who surrounded the courtyard. They stood at perfect intervals, creating a human barrier between the ceremony and the crowds of onlookers who had gathered to witness the international display. Each guard was a study in absolute stillness, their red tunics and towering bearskin hats creating an imposing visual barrier that somehow managed to be both decorative and functional. Mitchell found himself studying the guard position directly to his left, about 15 feet away. The man stood with the kind of unwavering attention that Mitchell had rarely seen even among his most disciplined soldiers. His rifle was held at the precise angle required by regulations. His posture was absolutely vertical, and his gaze remained fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. Not once during the 30 minutes Mitchell observed him did the guard shift his weight, adjust his grip, or show any sign of human discomfort. It was impressive, Mitchell admitted to himself, but it was also limiting. This kind of rigid ceremonial bearing, while visually striking, seemed to prioritize appearance over adaptability. In Mitchell's experience, the best soldiers were those who could maintain high standards while remaining flexible enough to respond to changing circumstances. These guards, for all their obvious discipline, struck him as inflexible by design. The thought would prove to be prophetic. As the ceremony moved into its central phase, Mitchell noticed a subtle shift in the positioning of the delegations. The movement was so gradual, so carefully orchestrated, that most observers probably didn't notice it happening. But Mitchell's trained eye caught the adjustment, and he realized that the repositioning was creating exactly the kind of hierarchical inconsistency that had bothered him during the morning ceremony. The repositioning placed him behind a British lieutenant colonel who was clearly junior to him in terms of experience and time in service. The man was competent enough, Mitchell was sure, but he was also significantly younger and had likely never commanded troops in combat situations. The optics were wrong, and Mitchell found himself facing the same decision that had created tension earlier in the day. This time, however, the stakes were higher. The royal family was watching. International media was present. Diplomatic relationships were on display. Any movement Mitchell made would be noticed, analyzed, and potentially misinterpreted by observers who might not understand the military reasoning behind his actions. But Mitchell had reached a decision during the lunch break, and he wasn't going to let diplomatic concerns override what he saw as proper military protocol. He began to move. The adjustment was subtle at first, a half step forward, a slight shift in angle that brought him more in line with where he believed he should be positioned based on rank and experience. He moved slowly, carefully, trying to minimize disruption to the ceremony, while correcting what he saw as an obvious error in the formation planning. The reaction was immediate, though so subtle that only those closest to him noticed it initially. The British lieutenant colonel he was attempting to move ahead of stiffened almost imperceptibly. The Air Force colonel beside him turned his head just enough to fix Mitchell with a stare that could have frozen water. Most significantly, the Royal Guard to his left, the one Mitchell had been observing for the past half hour, shifted his attention from the middle distance to Mitchell's movement. It was a tiny change, barely noticeable to casual observers, but Mitchell felt the weight of that attention like a physical force. The guard wasn't just watching him now. He was evaluating him, measuring his actions against some internal standard that Mitchell didn't understand but was beginning to suspect he had violated. Mitchell hesitated, suddenly, uncertain whether to continue with his repositioning or return to his original place. In that moment of hesitation, he made eye contact with the Royal Guard, and what he saw there stopped him cold. The guard's expression was completely neutral, professionally blank in the way that only military personnel could achieve. But his eyes held something that Mitchell recognized from his own experience in command situations. The look of a soldier who was prepared to take action if circumstances required it. It wasn't threatening, exactly, but it was absolutely certain. Mitchell realized, with a clarity that was both surprising and uncomfortable, that he was being warned. The warning was delivered without words, without gestures, without any overt action that might disrupt the ceremony or create a diplomatic incident. But it was unmistakably clear. Any further movement on Mitchell's part would be met with a response from the Royal Guard, and that response would not be pleasant for anyone involved. For a moment, Mitchell found himself frozen between his instinct to assert what he saw as proper military hierarchy and his growing understanding that he was operating in an environment where his normal assumptions about authority and protocol might not apply. The guard continued to watch him with that same neutral, prepared expression, waiting to see what Mitchell would decide to do. Around them, the ceremony continued without pause. The royal family maintained their dignified attention to the proceedings, the diplomatic delegations executed their roles flawlessly, and the international media captured images that would represent this moment of cooperation between allied nations. Only Mitchell seemed caught in a bubble of tension that threatened to expand into something much larger and more problematic. The British lieutenant colonel he had been attempting to move ahead of had noticed Mitchell's hesitation and turned slightly to offer what might have been either assistance or warning. Mitchell couldn't be sure which. Their eyes met for a moment, and the British officer's expression was carefully neutral, but clearly concerned. "Everything all right, Colonel?" the lieutenant colonel asked quietly, his voice pitched so low that it wouldn't carry to nearby observers. Mitchell nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He was beginning to understand that his attempts to assert proper military hierarchy were being interpreted as something else entirely, as disrespect for the ceremony, as disregard for established protocol, as the kind of cultural insensitivity that could create lasting damage to international relationships. But understanding the problem and knowing how to resolve it were two different things entirely. Mitchell found himself in a position he rarely experienced, genuinely uncertain about the correct course of action. His instincts as a military officer told him to maintain proper hierarchical positioning regardless of cultural considerations. His experience as a leader warned him that backing down now might be seen as weakness by the officers around him. His growing awareness of the diplomatic implications suggested that any further movement could create problems that would extend far beyond this single ceremony. And through it all, the Royal Guard continued to watch him with that same prepared, patient attention. The moment stretched longer than seemed possible, though in reality, it probably lasted no more than 30 seconds. To Mitchell, it felt like an eternity of indecision, with dozens of eyes focused on him and his next move potentially affecting relationships between nations. Finally, he made his decision. Instead of continuing forward or returning to his original position, Mitchell chose a middle course that he hoped would satisfy both his sense of proper military bearing and the ceremonial requirements of the situation. He adjusted his position slightly, moving to a spot that was closer to where he felt he should be hierarchically while remaining within the general boundaries of his assigned location. It was a compromise, and Mitchell hated compromises. But it seemed to work, at least initially. The British lieutenant colonel relaxed slightly. The Air Force colonel beside him returned his attention to the ceremony, and the general tension around Mitchell's section of the delegation began to dissipate. The Royal Guard, however, continued to watch him. That attention, Mitchell realized, wasn't going to disappear just because he had found a temporary solution to the positioning problem. The Guard had identified him as a potential source of disruption, and until the ceremony concluded, Mitchell would remain under that watchful scrutiny. The realization was both humbling and irritating. Mitchell was accustomed to being the one providing oversight, not receiving it. He was used to being the authority figure whose attention others sought to avoid, not the potential problem requiring management. The role reversal was uncomfortable, and it reinforced his growing sense that this entire situation had spiraled beyond his control in ways he didn't fully understand. As the ceremony moved toward its climactic moments, Mitchell found himself caught between competing impulses. Part of him wanted to assert his authority more decisively, to demonstrate that American military officers didn't yield to implied threats or cultural pressure. Another part of him recognized that he was representing his country in a delicate diplomatic situation where personal pride needed to be subordinated to larger strategic considerations. But the largest part of him was beginning to understand that he had fundamentally misread the situation from the beginning. The Royal Guards weren't just ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. They were active-duty military personnel executing a complex security and protocol mission while maintaining centuries-old traditions that served purposes Mitchell was only beginning to grasp. Their stillness wasn't rigidity, it was discipline. Their attention wasn't theatrical, it was professional. Their adherence to protocol wasn't inflexibility. It was expertise in an area where Mitchell had revealed himself to be a novice despite his decades of military experience. The ceremony reached its formal conclusion with the precision that had characterized every moment of the proceedings. The royal family departed according to established protocol. The diplomatic delegations began their carefully choreographed dispersal, and the royal guards maintained their positions until the last official observer had left the courtyard. Only then did the guard who had been watching Mitchell allow his attention to shift back to the middle distance. But as the ceremony concluded and the various participants began to move toward the reception area, Mitchell realized that his day was far from over. The afternoon's events had created ripples that would need to be addressed, relationships that would need to be repaired, and explanations that would need to be provided. More immediately, he found himself approached by the same British major who had tried to counsel him during the lunch break. "Colonel Mitchell," the major said, his tone even more carefully neutral than it had been earlier, "I believe we need to have another conversation." Mitchell nodded, following the major toward a quiet area away from the dispersing crowd. He knew that whatever came next would be more challenging than anything he had faced during the ceremony itself. The afternoon had revealed gaps in his understanding that went far beyond simple protocol differences, and addressing those gaps would require a kind of humility that Mitchell found difficult to embrace. Behind them, the royal guards began their own departure from the courtyard, moving with the same precision they had maintained throughout the ceremony. The guard who had watched Mitchell so closely passed within a few feet of him, and, for just a moment, their eyes met again. This time, the guard's expression was different, not threatening or warning, but somehow disappointed. It was the look of a professional who had hoped for better from a fellow military officer, and had been let down by what he had witnessed. Mitchell felt that look like a physical blow, and he realized that the afternoon's events had cost him something more valuable than position or protocol. They had cost him the respect of soldiers whose opinion should have mattered to him. The major was waiting patiently for him to join the conversation that would determine how the rest of his visit to England would proceed. Mitchell straightened his uniform one more time and prepared to face consequences he was only beginning to understand. The conversation with Major Harrison took place in a small chamber off the main castle corridor, away from the post-ceremony reception where diplomats and military officials were sharing polite conversations and diplomatic pleasantries. The room itself seemed designed for difficult discussions, formal enough to underscore the seriousness of the situation, but private enough to allow for honest communication without the constraints of public observation. Mitchell entered the room expecting a typical military debriefing, the kind of professional conversation he had participated in hundreds of times throughout his career. What he found instead was something that challenged his understanding of military courtesy, diplomatic protocol, and his own role as a representative of American military excellence. Major Harrison waited until Mitchell had taken a seat before beginning, and his opening words immediately established that this would not be a routine conversation. "Colonel Mitchell, I need to be frank with you about this afternoon's events. What happened during the ceremony has created concerns that extend well beyond simple protocol violations. We have a situation that could affect military relationships between our countries, and we need to address it directly and honestly." Mitchell felt his defensive instincts engage immediately. Throughout his career, he had learned to recognize the tone that preceded criticism, and he had developed strategies for deflecting or redirecting such conversations. But Something in Major Harrison's manner suggested that his usual approaches might not be effective in this situation. Major, I understand that there may have been some confusion about positioning during the ceremony, but I want to assure you that my intentions were entirely professional. I was simply trying to ensure that American military standards were properly represented. Harrison nodded, but his expression remained serious. Colonel, I appreciate your intentions, and I have no doubt that your actions were motivated by your commitment to representing your country with honor. However, I need to help you understand the broader context of what occurred this afternoon, because I believe there are aspects of the situation that may not have been apparent to you. What followed was a 15-minute explanation that fundamentally altered Mitchell's understanding of everything that had transpired since his arrival at Windsor Castle. Harrison explained, with patient thoroughness, the historical significance of the ceremony they had just completed, the specific protocols that governed international military cooperation at royal events, and the carefully balanced diplomatic considerations that influenced every aspect of the proceedings. But, more importantly, Harrison explained the role and authority of the Royal Guards in ways that revealed how completely Mitchell had misunderstood their function and capabilities. The gentlemen you encountered this afternoon are not ceremonial soldiers, Colonel. They are active duty guards who have undergone some of the most rigorous training in the British military. Many of them are combat veterans with extensive operational experience. Their ceremonial duties are just one aspect of their responsibilities, and when they're performing those duties, they have absolute authority to maintain protocol and security within their assigned areas. Mitchell felt a cold realization beginning to form in his mind. Are you saying that the guard who was watching me had the authority to intervene if he felt it was necessary? I'm saying, Colonel, that the guard who was watching you had both the authority and the responsibility to intervene if your actions had continued to disrupt the ceremony. And I need to be very clear about this. Such an intervention would not have been pleasant for anyone involved, but particularly not for you. The implications of Harrison's words settled over Mitchell like a heavy blanket. He had spent the afternoon positioning himself in potential conflict with soldiers who had not only the training and authority to respond to his actions, but the absolute certainty that they would do so if circumstances required it. What exactly would have happened if I had continued to move forward? Mitchell asked, though he wasn't certain he wanted to hear the answer. Harrison's response was delivered with the kind of clinical precision that military officers used when discussing unpleasant but necessary topics. The guard would have approached you directly and instructed you to return to your assigned position. If you had refused or continued to move, he would have physically restrained you and removed you from the ceremony. The entire incident would have been witnessed by representatives from 12 nations, including members of the royal family, and would undoubtedly have been captured by international media. Mitchell felt the blood drain from his face as he contemplated the full scope of the disaster he had narrowly avoided. The image of himself being physically restrained by a royal guard, in full view of international observers and media cameras, was almost too embarrassing to contemplate. But, more than embarrassment, he was beginning to understand the serious diplomatic implications of such an incident. The guard who was watching me, Mitchell said slowly, he was giving me a warning, wasn't he? He was giving you an opportunity to resolve the situation yourself before he was required to resolve it for you. That opportunity was an act of professional courtesy between military personnel, and I want you to understand how unusual it was. The guards are not typically inclined to provide warnings or second chances when protocol is being violated during royal ceremonies. Mitchell sat in silence for several minutes, processing the full implications of what Harrison had told him. He was beginning to understand that his afternoon had not been a series of minor protocol adjustments that had created temporary tension. Instead, it had been a progression toward a potentially career-ending diplomatic disaster, prevented only by the professional courtesy of a royal guard whose patience and discretion had saved Mitchell from public humiliation. But Harrison wasn't finished. Colonel, there's another aspect of this situation that we need to discuss. Your actions this afternoon were observed not just by the royal guards, but by military officers from several allied nations. Some of those officers have expressed concerns about what they witnessed, and those concerns are being communicated through appropriate diplomatic channels. The cold realization that had been building in Mitchell's mind suddenly crystallized into something approaching panic. He was beginning to understand that the consequences of his afternoon might extend far beyond his current visit to England. "What kind of concerns?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Concerns about cultural sensitivity, respect for Allied traditions, and the ability of American military personnel to operate effectively in international cooperative environments. These are not trivial concerns, Colonel. They touch on fundamental questions about military cooperation and alliance relationships." Mitchell found himself facing a reality he had never anticipated. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on his ability to represent American military values with honor and distinction. He had commanded respect from subordinates, peers, and superiors alike through his commitment to excellence and his unwavering adherence to military standards. But now he was discovering that those same qualities, applied without cultural awareness or diplomatic sensitivity, could create serious problems in international environments. "Major Harrison," Mitchell said finally, "I need to ask you directly, what do I need to do to address this situation?" Harrison's response revealed the depth of the challenge Mitchell faced. "Colonel, I believe the first step is for you to understand that this situation cannot be fully addressed in the traditional sense. What happened this afternoon has already occurred, and it has already been observed by people whose opinions matter in ways that extend far beyond this single ceremony. The question now is how you choose to respond to what has happened, and how that response might influence future perceptions of your professionalism and cultural competence." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering topics that Mitchell had never had to consider throughout his military career. Harrison explained the subtle ways that cultural insensitivity could damage international relationships, the long-term implications of being perceived as difficult to work with in multinational environments, and the specific steps that might help to mitigate the damage from the afternoon's events. But underlying all of these practical considerations was a more fundamental challenge that Mitchell was only beginning to recognize. His actions during the ceremony had revealed gaps in his understanding that went far beyond simple protocol knowledge. They had exposed assumptions about authority, respect, and military bearing that were proving to be inadequate for the international environments where modern military cooperation increasingly took place. As the conversation concluded, Harrison made one final point that would stay with Mitchell for the rest of his career. "Colonel, I want you to understand that the Royal Guard who showed restraint this afternoon is a professional soldier with extensive combat experience and absolute commitment to his duties. When he chose to give you that warning rather than immediately enforcing protocol, he was extending you a courtesy that reflected his respect for you as a fellow military officer. That respect was not based on your rank or your authority. It was based on his assumption that you would recognize the warning for what it was and respond appropriately." Mitchell left the conversation with a clear understanding of what would happen next. He would attend the evening reception, where he would need to interact professionally with the same officers who had witnessed his protocol violations. He would complete the remaining days of his visit to England, during which his behavior would be closely observed and evaluated. And he would return to the United States with a report that would likely include detailed commentary on his cultural competence and suitability for future international assignments. But more immediately, he found himself facing a personal reckoning that was proving to be more challenging than any professional consequences. For the first time in his career, Mitchell was forced to confront the possibility that his understanding of military leadership, professional competence, and cultural awareness might be fundamentally inadequate for the modern international environment where his country's military increasingly operated. The evening reception took place in the castle's grand ballroom, a space that seemed designed to underscore the weight of tradition and the importance of diplomatic courtesy. Mitchell entered the room with carefully controlled composure, knowing that every interaction would be observed and evaluated by officers who had already formed opinions about his professionalism based on the afternoon's events. The challenge he faced was immediately apparent. Conversations that should have been routine expressions of professional courtesy were now complicated by unspoken questions about his judgment and cultural sensitivity. Officers who might have been interested in learning about American military perspectives now seemed more focused on assessing whether he could be trusted to behave appropriately in sensitive situations. Mitchell realized that he was no longer participating in a cultural exchange designed to strengthen international military cooperation. Instead, he was defending his reputation and his competence in an environment where every word and gesture carried implications that extended far beyond simple social interaction. The royal guard who had monitored him during the ceremony was not present at the reception, but Mitchell found himself thinking about that brief encounter throughout the evening. The guard's restrained professionalism, his willingness to provide a warning rather than immediately enforcing protocol, and his obvious disappointment at Mitchell's behavior had revealed a standard of military bearing that Mitchell was beginning to recognize as superior to his own approach. As the evening progressed, Mitchell began to understand that his real education was just beginning. The afternoon's events had revealed gaps in his knowledge and assumptions that would require years of careful study and practice to address. More importantly, they had challenged his fundamental understanding of what it meant to be a professional military officer in an interconnected world where cultural competence was as important as technical expertise. The reception concluded with the same precision that had characterized every aspect of his visit to Windsor Castle. But Mitchell left the event with the uncomfortable awareness that his own performance had been the one element that had fallen short of the professional standards expected in such environments. The next morning brought a development that Mitchell had not anticipated and certainly had not prepared for. He was awakened at 0600 by a knock on his quarters door, followed by the delivery of a message that would fundamentally alter his understanding of the previous day's events and their aftermath. The message was brief, formal, and entirely unexpected. Colonel Mitchell was requested to attend a private meeting at 0800 with the very royal guard who had monitored his behavior during the ceremony. The meeting would take place in one of the castle's smaller conference rooms, away from the areas where other participants in the cultural exchange program might observe or overhear their conversation. Mitchell's first reaction was confusion. In his experience, enlisted personnel and non-commissioned officers did not request meetings with senior officers, particularly not officers from foreign military services. The protocol seemed backwards, almost insulting, and his instinct was to decline the meeting or at least insist that it take place through proper military channels with appropriate supervision. But something about the formal tone of the request, combined with his growing awareness that he was operating in an environment where his normal assumptions about military protocol might not apply, convinced him to accept the meeting. Perhaps this would be an opportunity to clarify the previous day's events, to explain his actions more fully, or to establish a better understanding with the British personnel who had clearly misinterpreted his intentions. Mitchell arrived at the designated conference room precisely at 0800, expecting to find a formal military environment with appropriate protocols for international military communication. Instead, he found himself face-to-face with the Royal Guard in an informal setting that immediately challenged his expectations about how such encounters should proceed. The guard had changed from his ceremonial uniform into standard military dress, and the transformation was remarkable. Without the imposing bearskin hat and elaborate red tunic, he appeared as what he actually was, a professional soldier with obvious experience and quiet confidence. Mitchell realized that his mental image of the guards as ceremonial figures had prevented him from seeing them as the experienced military personnel they actually were. "Colonel Mitchell," the guard said, rising from his chair as Mitchell entered the room. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I'm Sergeant Major William Thompson, and I believe we have some things to discuss about yesterday's ceremony." The introduction immediately established several important facts that Mitchell had not previously understood. First, the guard was a senior non-commissioned officer, not the junior enlisted soldier Mitchell had assumed. Second, he was clearly comfortable taking initiative in professional military situations, suggesting a level of authority and responsibility that Mitchell had not recognized. Third, he was approaching this conversation as a peer-to-peer military discussion rather than a superior-subordinate interaction. Mitchell took the offered seat, but found himself uncertain about how to proceed. The meeting was unlike anything in his previous military experience, and he lacked a clear framework for understanding its purpose or appropriate conduct. Sergeant Major Thompson seemed to recognize Mitchell's uncertainty and took the initiative in establishing the tone and direction of their discussion. "Colonel, I want to begin by saying that I have great respect for your military service and your commitment to representing your country with honor. I've reviewed your service record, and I understand that you have extensive experience in command positions and have served with distinction in challenging operational environments." Mitchell felt a moment of surprise at the revelation that Thompson had reviewed his service record, but Thompson continued before he could respond. "However, I also need to be direct with you about what I observed yesterday, because I believe there are lessons in that experience that could be valuable for both of us." What followed was perhaps the most unusual military conversation of Mitchell's career. Thompson spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had earned his position through years of dedicated service and demonstrated competence, but he also displayed a depth of cultural and military knowledge that challenged many of Mitchell's assumptions about the relative capabilities of American and British military personnel. Thompson explained that he had served 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, often in joint operations with American forces. He had worked closely with U.S. Army, Marine Corps, and Special Operations personnel, and had developed both professional respect for American military capabilities and personal friendships with American service members. "Colonel, I want you to understand that my observations yesterday were not based on any anti-American sentiment or cultural bias. They were based on my experience working with American military personnel who demonstrated exceptional cultural competence and professional adaptability in international environments." Thompson paused, allowing Mitchell to process this information before continuing. "What I observed yesterday was behavior that was inconsistent with the standards I've come to expect from senior American officers, and I was concerned that it might reflect either a lack of preparation for international military cooperation or a misunderstanding of the protocols that govern such cooperation." Mitchell felt his defensive instincts engaging, but Thompson's respectful tone and obvious professional competence made it difficult to dismiss his observations as inappropriate criticism. "Sergeant Major Thompson," Mitchell said carefully, "I want to assure you that my actions yesterday were motivated entirely by my commitment to maintaining proper military standards and representing my country appropriately. If there were protocol violations, they were unintentional and resulted from differences in military culture rather than any disrespect for British traditions." Thompson nodded, but his response revealed that he understood the situation more clearly than Mitchell had anticipated. "Colonel, I appreciate that your intentions were professional, and I want to acknowledge that international military cooperation can present challenges that are not immediately obvious to officers who haven't had extensive experience in such environments. However, I also need to help you understand that the protocols governing yesterday's ceremony were not arbitrary British traditions. They were carefully designed procedures that serve important diplomatic and security functions." What followed was a detailed explanation of the complex considerations that influenced every aspect of international military ceremonies at royal venues. Thompson explained the historical precedents, the diplomatic sensitivities, the security requirements, and the cultural factors that made strict adherence to established protocols essential rather than optional. But, more importantly, Thompson explained how Mitchell's attempts to assert hierarchical positioning had been interpreted by the international observers who witnessed them. "Colonel, when you moved out of your assigned position, it was observed by military officers from 12 different nations. Those officers understood the established protocols, and they interpreted your movement as either a lack of preparation for the ceremony or a deliberate disregard for agreed-upon procedures." Mitchell felt a sinking sensation as he began to understand the broader implications of his actions. "Some of those officers," Thompson continued, "have worked extensively with American military personnel in operational environments, and they were surprised to see behavior that seemed inconsistent with the cultural competence they expect from senior American officers. The conversation continued for over an hour, covering topics that Mitchell had never had to consider throughout his military career. Thompson explained the subtle ways that cultural insensitivity could undermine military cooperation, the long-term effects of being perceived as difficult to work with in international environments, and the specific skills that successful international military leaders needed to develop. But the most challenging aspect of the conversation was Thompson's gentle but persistent questioning of Mitchell's fundamental assumptions about authority, respect, and military bearing. "Colonel, may I ask what you expected to happen when you moved out of your assigned position yesterday?" Mitchell found himself struggling to provide a satisfactory answer. At the time, his actions had seemed obviously justified by military hierarchy and professional standards. But now, in the face of Thompson's patient questioning, he was discovering that his expectations had been based on assumptions that didn't apply in the international ceremonial environment where he had been operating. "I expected that proper military courtesy would require adjustments to ensure that rank and experience were appropriately recognized," Mitchell said finally. Thompson's response was delivered with the kind of respectful directness that only experienced military professionals could achieve. "Colonel, with respect, what you encountered yesterday was proper military courtesy. The protocols were established through coordination between military professionals from multiple nations, including senior American officers who understood both the ceremonial requirements and the diplomatic considerations involved." Thompson paused, allowing Mitchell to process this information. "When you moved out of position, you were not asserting proper military hierarchy. You were rejecting protocols that had been agreed upon by your own chain of command and ratified by American military leadership." The implications of Thompson's words were staggering. Mitchell realized that he had not been defending American military standards. He had been violating them. His actions had not demonstrated professional competence. They had revealed his lack of preparation for the specific environment where he was operating. "Sergeant Major," Mitchell said slowly, "are you telling me that my superiors expected me to follow the established protocols regardless of my personal assessment of their appropriateness?" Thompson's answer was both gentle and absolutely clear. "Colonel, I'm telling you that your superiors expected you to demonstrate the same cultural competence and professional adaptability that American military personnel display every day in international cooperative environments around the world." The remainder of their conversation focused on practical steps that Mitchell might take to address the gaps in his knowledge and experience that had been revealed by the previous day's events. Thompson recommended specific resources for learning about international military cooperation, suggested training programs that focused on cultural competence, and offered insights based on his extensive experience working with American personnel in multinational environments. But more importantly, Thompson offered something that Mitchell had not expected: genuine respect for his service and confidence in his ability to learn from the experience. "Colonel, I want you to understand that what happened yesterday does not define you as a military officer. You have a distinguished record of service and obvious commitment to excellence. This experience could be a foundation for developing the additional skills you'll need for future international assignments, if you choose to approach it as a learning opportunity rather than a professional setback." As their meeting concluded, Thompson made one final observation that would influence Mitchell's thinking for months afterward. "Colonel, the military environment where we operate today requires leaders who can maintain their core professional values while adapting to cultural contexts that may be unfamiliar or challenging. The officers who succeed in this environment are those who understand that true strength sometimes requires the humility to learn from others, even when those others may be junior in rank or from different military traditions." Mitchell left the meeting with a completely transformed understanding of the previous day's events and their implications for his career and his development as a military leader. The conversation with Sergeant Major Thompson had revealed that his challenges went far beyond simple protocol violations or cultural misunderstandings. They reflected fundamental gaps in his preparation for the international military environment where he would increasingly be expected to operate. But, more importantly, the meeting had provided him with a framework for addressing those challenges and developing the competencies he would need for future success. Thompson had offered not just criticism, but practical guidance and genuine support for Mitchell's professional development. As Mitchell prepared for the final day of his visit to Windsor Castle, he realized that his real education in international military leadership was just beginning. The ceremony, the conversations with Major Harrison and Sergeant Major Thompson, and his own uncomfortable recognition of his limitations had created an opportunity for growth that would require years of dedicated effort to fully realize. The question now was whether he would have the courage and humility to pursue that opportunity, even when it required acknowledging that his previous understanding of military excellence had been incomplete. 6 months later, Colonel James Mitchell found himself standing in another formation, in another country, facing another test of his ability to operate effectively in an international military environment. But this time, everything was different. The ceremony was taking place at NATO headquarters in Brussels, where military officers from 28 nations were participating in a joint training exercise designed to improve multinational cooperation and interoperability. Mitchell had been selected to participate not despite his experience at Windsor Castle, but because of it. His superiors had recognized that the lessons learned from that difficult experience had transformed him into a more effective international military leader. The selection had not been automatic. Mitchell's performance review following his return from England had been brutally honest about his shortcomings in cultural competence and international protocol. But it had also acknowledged his professional competence in other areas and recommended specific training programs that might address his developmental needs. Mitchell had embraced those recommendations with the same intensity he had once applied to purely tactical military training. He had completed cultural competency courses, participated in international military exchanges, and sought out opportunities to work with allied personnel in environments where his assumptions about protocol and hierarchy would be challenged and refined. More importantly, he had maintained contact with Sergeant Major Thompson, who had become an unexpected mentor in the complex art of international military cooperation. Their correspondence had evolved from formal military communication into genuine professional dialogue, with Thompson providing insights and guidance that had proven invaluable as Mitchell worked to develop capabilities he had never known he lacked. The NATO ceremony presented challenges that would have seemed impossible to navigate 6 months earlier. Officers from nations with vastly different military traditions, cultural backgrounds, and operational experiences were required to work together seamlessly while maintaining their individual national identities and professional standards. Mitchell found himself assigned to lead a mixed formation that included officers from Germany, France, Canada, Poland, and the Netherlands. Each nation had its own protocols, its own understanding of military courtesy, and its own expectations about leadership and authority. The challenge was not simply to avoid protocol violations, but to create unity and effectiveness within diversity. As the formation prepared for the ceremony, Mitchell encountered the first real test of his transformed approach to international military leadership. The German colonel assigned to his formation had extensive operational experience and clear opinions about the proper execution of multinational military procedures. His recommendations were professionally sound, but they differed significantly from the approach Mitchell had initially planned to implement. 6 months earlier, Mitchell would have asserted his authority as the designated formation leader and insisted on implementing his original plan regardless of input from subordinate officers. The result would have been technically correct, but culturally tone-deaf, creating exactly the kind of tension that undermined multinational military effectiveness. Instead, Mitchell found himself applying lessons learned from his encounter with the Royal Guard and his subsequent conversations with Sergeant Major Thompson. He listened carefully to the German colonel's recommendations, asked thoughtful questions about their rationale, and worked collaboratively to develop an approach that incorporated the best elements of both perspectives while maintaining the formation's ability to execute its assigned role effectively. The process was more complex and time-consuming than simply asserting hierarchical authority, but the results were dramatically superior. The officers in Mitchell's formation began to work together with genuine cooperation rather than grudging compliance, and their collective performance exceeded what any of them could have achieved through purely individual effort. But the real test came during the ceremony itself, when unexpected circumstances required rapid adaptation to changing conditions. A security alert interrupted the planned proceedings, requiring all formations to implement alternative protocols while maintaining their ceremonial responsibilities. The situation was exactly the kind of complex, ambiguous challenge that revealed the difference between officers who could only operate effectively within familiar parameters and those who had developed the cultural competence and adaptability required for multinational environments. Mitchell's formation faced a particularly difficult challenge. The alternative protocols required them to modify their positions and movements in ways that created potential conflicts between different national approaches to military ceremony. The German approach emphasized precision and adherence to established procedures. The French perspective prioritized visual elegance and ceremonial dignity, and the Canadian viewpoint focused on practical effectiveness and safety considerations. Under pressure, with limited time for extended discussion, Mitchell needed to make decisions that would satisfy all of these concerns while ensuring that his formation could execute its modified responsibilities without compromising the broader ceremony success. The solution he developed drew directly from his experience at Windsor Castle, but applied those lessons in ways that demonstrated how completely his understanding of international military leadership had evolved. Instead of trying to impose a single approach that might satisfy his own preferences while ignoring cultural differences, Mitchell worked with his officers to identify the essential requirements that all of their national perspectives shared, and then build a modified approach around those common elements while allowing for individual variations that respected each nation's military traditions. The process required exactly the kind of humility and cultural competence that Sergeant Major Thompson had emphasized during their conversation at Windsor Castle. Mitchell needed to acknowledge that his perspective, while valuable, was not automatically superior to others simply because he held the formation leadership position. He needed to demonstrate genuine respect for military traditions that differed from his own experience, and he needed to create solutions that served the collective mission rather than his individual preferences. The modified ceremony proceeded flawlessly, with Mitchell's formation executing their responsibilities with the kind of seamless cooperation that represented the best of multinational military capability. But, more importantly, the experience demonstrated that Mitchell had developed the skills necessary to lead effectively in the complex international environment where modern military operations increasingly took place. After the ceremony, Mitchell found himself approached by several of the officers from his formation, each of whom offered perspectives on his leadership that would have been inconceivable 6 months earlier. The German colonel commended Mitchell's willingness to incorporate diverse viewpoints into his decision-making process, noting that many American officers he had worked with seemed more interested in asserting authority than in achieving collective effectiveness. The French lieutenant colonel praised Mitchell's understanding of ceremonial dignity and cultural sensitivity, observing that his approach had demonstrated genuine respect for Allied traditions while maintaining operational excellence. Most significantly, the Canadian major offered an observation that directly connected Mitchell's current performance to his experience at Windsor Castle. "Colonel Mitchell, I don't know what training you've completed recently, but your approach to multinational leadership is exceptional. You demonstrate exactly the kind of cultural competence and professional adaptability that makes international military cooperation possible." The comment prompted Mitchell to reflect on the journey that had brought him from the embarrassment and confusion of his encounter with the Royal Guard to his current position as a recognized expert in multinational military cooperation. The transformation had required him to fundamentally reconsider his understanding of military excellence, professional authority, and cultural competence. He had been forced to acknowledge that technical proficiency and traditional leadership skills, while necessary, were not sufficient for success in international military environments that demanded additional capabilities he had never developed. More importantly, He had learned that true military strength sometimes required the humility to learn from others, even when those others were junior in rank, from different military traditions, or operating according to protocols that seemed unfamiliar or challenging. That evening, Mitchell composed a message to Sergeant Major Thompson, updating him on the day's events and thanking him once again for the patience and professionalism he had demonstrated during their encounter at Windsor Castle. Thompson's reply arrived the next morning, and it included an observation that captured the essential lesson of Mitchell's entire experience. "Colonel, what you've accomplished over the past 6 months demonstrates something that I think is often misunderstood about military excellence. True professional competence is not about imposing your standards on every situation you encounter. It's about understanding how your capabilities can be most effectively applied to serve the mission, even when that requires adapting to circumstances that may be unfamiliar or challenging." Thompson continued with a reflection that went to the heart of modern military leadership. "The military environment where we operate today rewards leaders who can maintain their core values while demonstrating genuine respect for allied traditions and capabilities. The officers who succeed in this environment are those who understand that strength and adaptability are not contradictory qualities. They're complementary capabilities that reinforce each other when properly developed." As Mitchell prepared to return to the United States, he realized that his experience had provided him with more than just improved skills for international military cooperation. It had given him a more sophisticated understanding of military leadership itself, one that recognized the complex relationships between authority and respect, between tradition and adaptation, between individual excellence and collective effectiveness. The encounter with the Royal Guard at Windsor Castle had initially seemed like a professional setback, a moment of embarrassment that revealed gaps in his preparation for international military service. But over time, it had proven to be one of the most valuable learning experiences of his career, providing insights that had transformed his effectiveness as a military leader and his understanding of what military excellence truly required. 6 months later, Colonel Mitchell had become the kind of international military leader he had not even known existed before his encounter with Sergeant Major Thompson. He had developed the cultural competence and professional adaptability that modern military service increasingly demanded, and he had learned to apply those capabilities in ways that enhanced rather than compromised his effectiveness as an American military officer. But perhaps most importantly, he had learned that military excellence was not a destination, but a journey, one that required continuous learning, genuine humility, and the courage to acknowledge that even experienced leaders could benefit from the wisdom and guidance of others who brought different perspectives and experiences to the complex challenges of modern military service. The Royal Guard, who had once watched him with disapproving attention, had become, through their brief encounter and its aftermath, one of the most influential teachers in Mitchell's military career. The lesson they had taught was not delivered through formal instruction or traditional military training, but through the simple demonstration of professional standards that Mitchell had not previously understood or appreciated. That lesson, that true military bearing sometimes required the strength to yield, that genuine authority was earned rather than asserted, and that cultural competence was not an optional addition to military skills, but an essential requirement for effective service, had transformed Mitchell's understanding of what it meant to be a military leader in an interconnected world. As his plane lifted off from Brussels, carrying him back to the United States and to new challenges that would test his evolved capabilities, Mitchell reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from embarrassment at Windsor Castle to recognition as an expert in international military cooperation. The journey had been difficult, requiring him to acknowledge limitations and develop capabilities he had not known he needed. But it had also been invaluable, providing him with skills and perspective that would serve him throughout the remainder of his career and beyond. The Royal Guard's answer had indeed stopped him cold, not through force or confrontation, but through the demonstration of professional standards that had challenged his assumptions and ultimately transformed his understanding of military excellence itself. In the end, the Guard's greatest service to Mitchell had not been the warning that prevented a diplomatic disaster, but The example that had inspired a personal and professional transformation that would benefit not only Mitchell himself, but every soldier he would lead and every ally he would serve alongside for the rest of his distinguished career.